It is time again for Legal Talk on eRadio, and today we ask the question, is our sanitizer legislation adequate enough if another pandemic strikes? Which is a very interesting topic. So joining us to discuss it from Hahn attorneys is Janet Tomkow-Coetzer, and we are talking about hand sanitizers. Not seeing too many of them around nowadays. Janet, very good morning to you.
Good morning. Yes, no, we are not at the moment. I think everything's calmed down a bit after the frantic sales and production and all that was happening during COVID times.
Yeah, definitely. Tell me, before we get started, tell me a bit more about you.
Right. So I am an attorney at Hahn, and I deal with consumer law, the Consumer Protection Act, food labeling, as well as, commenting on regulations relating to foods and as well as even sanitizers, which was quite an interesting turn that happened, and we saw a massive increase during COVID, naturally, because that is where everybody turned to. I also am involved in intellectual property law, so there's a whole bunch of stuff that I like to work on.
That's nice. So obviously today is right up your alley as we talk about hand sanitizers. Now, they've been around for so long. They've always been on the shelves. We just didn't really notice it, unless you're a germaphobe. You didn't really notice it on the shelves until the pandemic hit 2 years ago. So one would, assume that sanitizers are properly regulated and that there's really nothing to be concerned about. But isn't the labeling of a product that sanitizes your hands as easy as stating hand sanitizer or hand disinfectant?
Fortunately, it's actually not that easy. One would think so. And I think a lot of individuals that wanted to start supplying and manufacturing hand sanitizers when COVID hit found this out. So luckily for consumers, it's actually not that easy. And I say this because consumers obviously want to know what they are spraying or rubbing onto their hands. Obviously, every time you walk into a shop, it's now required, And the labeling of sanitizers and disinfectants is not that easy, and it's quite a number of things that you need to take into account. So luckily this is the legal segment, so I can really go into the legal aspects of things. There are different departments that also specifically handle hand sanitizers, and it's the Department of Health, it's the Department of Trade and Industry. And you would think it's only one act or one regulation that applies, but as it turns out in South Africa, sanitizers and disinfectants are regulated by 5 different acts, as well as the regulations and standards that fall under them. So you've got the Medicines and Related Substances Act, you've got the Foodstuffs, Cosmetics and Disinfectants Act, you've got the Standards Act, you've got the National Regulator for Compulsory Specifications, and the Legal Metrology Act. So it's quite a lot of things that actually, if you want to manufacture or supply, and sell these, you need to be aware of these legislation. And what you need to have a look at is the application surface, whether it's on human skin or an inanimate surface, such as like we use desks or all that, the environment that the sanitizer is used, the intended use, and then the composition. The hand sanitizers that we see at the stores, which are normally a rub-in or a leave-on, and they are products that are primarily used to sanitize the skin when soap and water are not available, and they're not rinsed off with water. And these are actually classified as low risk. And these are the ones where the sales went through the roof, I think. And they need to comply with the South African national standards, which actually specifically deals with disinfectant alcohol-based hand rubs. As well as the Legal Metrology Act. But I'll go into how these regulations have also changed and what's lacking. So just to give you an idea, when I was talking about high risk and low risk, disinfectants and germicides used on inanimate surfaces in low risk areas such as schools, restaurants, and all that, they fall under the Foodstuffs, Cosmetics and Disinfectants Act. They don't need to be registered in terms of the Medicines Related and Substances Act. So depending on your product, it means you need to register it, and it has to go through quite a rigorous registration process. But where it's low risk, like use disinfectants, it doesn't have to. Disinfectants where they're used in operating rooms, intensive care units, those fall under the Medicines Act, and those are classified as high risk. Antiseptic and antibacterial products, such as scrubs, are also seen as high risk and they fall under the Medicines Act. The ones that we are available, that you see in your local pharmacy and all that, they don't have to undergo a rigorous registration process. And that's very important to know, and how this is going to impact, how things have, or how it kind of shows how everything has been amended to cater for this. If, for example, another wave hits and another one and another one and another, because I feel like this is going to be a never-ending saga, and maybe perhaps with another pandemic. But it's also nice and important, especially for consumers, to understand the difference between sanitizers and disinfectants. They're actually not the same thing. So one of the main differences is that disinfectants contain chemicals which decontaminate a surface, and then sanitizers, they reduce the number of germs. So one pretty much just kills germs more than the other. And so you can't just label something for example, like you were saying, a hand sanitizer or a hand disinfectant, or saying both, a disinfectant or a sanitizer and disinfectant. It's not normally, it's not the same. There are two different things. And that is something, I think consumers should be aware of. And I'll talk about it later, about suppliers that did actually, they didn't comply with this and sold something like that. What's also interesting, prior to COVID and even now, the South African National Standards is voluntary in their application, even though they've been published, and they only become compulsory if they are incorporated into an act or a regulation. So these local, when I say local supermarket and pharmacy sanitizers, you know what I mean, because it's those ones that you walk in. It's the ones that are for low risk, The standards that they fall under are voluntary. How we took the view that in terms of the Consumer Protection Act, every consumer has the right to receive goods that comply with any applicable standards. And because of that, now we believe that the standards, it's called SANS 490 because that deals with alcohol-based hand rubs. It is actually applicable, and it must be considered to be compulsory. So that's always a nice a double take someone can do when they read this, when they hear me say that, because even though we've been informed by manufacturers, it's not compulsory under the Consumer Protection Act, because it is your duty. The whole point of this is to protect the consumer. And so that they have a product that's not misleading, and a product that complies with the standards and regulations. I mean, you don't want to be using a hand spray with hand sanitizer that doesn't sanitize or doesn't have the correct amount of alcohol to in fact do it. So you do want it to fall under something that the suppliers and manufacturers must comply with. And luckily under the Consumer Protection Act, you do have that. So to answer your question, it's never as easy. A lawyer will always say, well, it's a gray area. Labeling a product isn't as easy because there are many factors that you need to take in, whether it's a high-risk product, whether it's a disinfectant, whether it's a sanitizer, and what regulation it falls under. So, there's quite a few things that one needs to consider.
Thank you for that. Very, very interesting. And now, as we know that COVID-19 really threw a spanner in the works for so many industries, basically all industries, how has it affected the suppliers of hand sanitizers? Apart from making lots of money.
Apart from making lots of money. They did. Well, they had to be aware, or they should have been aware, of all the acts that I mentioned and the standards that falls under. Because all sanitizers, regardless of the usage and risk, must be assessed in terms of the NRCS Act and the Legal Metrology Act. So whether it's high risk or low risk, it then must be assessed in terms of these two acts. And obviously, where it's high risk, it will need to go through quite a long registration process through the Medicines and Related Substances Act and through. So it's, using that act. So they must be aware of this. And how it also affected was there were amendments made quickly, especially in 2022, 2020, because obviously our legislation back then was lacking a bit. So the standards that like I was mentioning before, is that SANS 490, which deals with disinfectant alcohol-based hand rubs. It was amended in 2020, and it sort of changed what need to be on the labels. It added, what the minimum alcohol concentration needs to be. So, for example, the company registration needed to be present on the label, a statement that it is alcohol-based hand sanitizer. So there's a specific statement now. The alcohol percentage that needs to be used. The nominal volume in the case of a liquid form hand sanitizer. Then the standard things like batch identification and expiry. But that 2020 amendment affected especially, manufacturers and all that, because it put a little bit more, if I could say, responsibility in them to label their products, and also what I did see during that time period was hand sanitizers that didn't have the correct amount of alcohol. So you thought that this is going to be disinfecting your hand, but all it really was doing was drying it out.
Yeah.
So thanks to this, it's true. You rely as a consumer that the product has the minimum alcohol concentration to obviously decrease the amount of germs on your hands, and it doesn't. So you would need, for example, a fraction of 70%, if alcohol was the only active ingredient, and then where there was other ingredients, it would be 60%. So then this was imposed, which obviously would then affect the formula, or, the product formulation, because they had to comply with this. And you could only use certain alcohols, such as ethanol, isopropanol, propanol, or a mixture of these, so there was also types of, because previously I don't think anybody realized the boom that this would have when it comes to sanitizers. And then you would have all types of coming up, like foam, aerosol, gel, liquid. So an amendment, this amendment to SANS 490 was very, very important, and very important to, the people manufacturing and the developers. What was also very important during this time period for SPAs was that in SANS 490, there's a little write-up there that says disinfectants for use on skin needs to be registered with the Medicines Control Council in South Africa. Now, that process is so long, anybody wanting to sell their products, immediately, because there were a lot of startups that happened because they saw a gap in the market. Then they realized, they have to go through this really lengthy registration process. And so to combat that, they came up, a notice was released actually as well. So 2020 was a very active period when it came to lots of notices and amendments and under legislation, which was released under the MRS Act, which excluded them, from having to register their alcohol-based hand rubs. Because if it's used to prevent or treat infection within a health establishment in a high-risk environment, those would immediately have to fall under the registration process. But this exclusion, luckily, said they didn't need to comply with this registration process. But interestingly enough, these exclusions actually end at the end of August this year.
Ooh.
And so far, nothing has been published to allow to an extended or anything like that. So what it means is, if you are a manufacturer of alcohol-based hand rubs that's used in a high-risk environment, after August 2022, you don't fall under this exclusion and you have to go through the registration process. And if we're hit with another pandemic, if they don't take into consideration what happened to us in COVID, then the same process will happen again, which I think is something that needs to be addressed. Although I suppose they would just issue another exclusion. I don't know. It's sort of, we'll see what happens. But at the moment, and I hope, manufacturers are aware of this, that in August 2022, this exclusion will actually expire. And sanitizers in high-risk areas will need to require registration. But low-risk areas, like for domestic use and for us, normal consumers, SANS 490 still applies.
Okay.
And, retailers must just ensure that their suppliers obviously comply with the NRCS, because the retailer also needs to make sure that they're not, stocking something in which can obviously, once a directive is issued, it'll be removed from the shelves if it's non-compliant, because that does happen.
Janet, what happens if a hand sanitizer doesn't comply with the current legislation?
Well, so we had a situation, Hahn and attorneys actually dealt with an issue with a non-compliant hand sanitizer, and so here was the thing, so now that I've given all the background, the product claimed to be a hand and surface sanitizer. Whereas, now you can't really have both. It's either on your skin or either on the surface. It can't be both, even though it's claiming to be, but then it falls under different categories. So the product then fell under a different classification because they then said it was hand and surface. And it was then seen as a disinfectant. So it then it was actually withdrawn from trade. It didn't have the end registration number, which was required. It didn't go through the registration process because, unfortunately, this company wasn't aware, of the requirements, wasn't aware that you actually are specific wording that you need to use, and that if you decide to use the word surface, it immediately falls as a disinfectant. A different act applies, so a different standard. So
I never knew.
If you don't No, and if it's important to know these things and to keep up to date, because, like I say, things keep changing. And in August, the exclusion for those hand sanitizers in high risk areas is going to fall away, so it needs to be registered. You can't just name your sanitizer anything, because labeling is actually really important. And if you don't comply, the Department of Trade and Industry is really impressive when it comes to, and the NRCS, when it comes to, enforcement, they really will issue a directive and they will remove your product.
Yeah.
And, in order to file an appeal and to go through that whole process is quite lengthy. And thereafter your product is taken off. You're left with this product where the labeling is all incorrect, and then you're left with the decision to either relabel everything, which will also be quite expensive. Lots of sort of knock-on effects if you don't know. Yeah, so manufacturers and they need to, make sure that they know the difference between the sanitizers, that there's different categories for sanitizers and disinfectants.
Yeah.
That there are different levels of risks and areas of consideration, that you can't call something a surface disinfectant unless it's registered with the NRCS. There are massive differences between each category, so it's important for a manufacturer to know these differences, especially when they develop their products, and also to prevent, having the products then removed from a shelf and then having to go through the whole rigmarole of having to appeal, change labels, all that stuff.
But I'm glad that they're so strict, because in the end it protects the consumer and it makes sure that we have quality products on our shelves. So that's really, really nice. I'm very impressed.
No, I have to say, the NRCS is excellent, and as is the DTI. You never want to be on their bad side, because they do issue directives, they do remove, because they do feel strongly about it, If your product doesn't comply, it mustn't be on the shelves.
So, in closing, for today's legal talk, the big question that we want to ask today is, if there is a reality of a future pandemic, is our legislation sufficient here in South Africa?
I don't believe it is sufficient. I think that, as I was speaking about that standard, SANS 490, I think it should be made compulsory so that there's no question that it's a voluntary, standard that you need to comply with, especially, they made so many amendments to it. And I believe that it should be made compulsory so that there's no doubt. Even though I believe that it falls under the Consumer Protection Act, because, consumers, it's their right to be, not to be misled and to have safe products sold to them. Also interesting, I think that it's not sufficient because I don't think that they've provided for non-alcoholic sanitizers with, the use of, pure active ingredients. Currently there's a minimum of 60% alcohol content required if the product contains active ingredients, but we've also had questions about non-alcoholic sanitizers, because I think the alcohol does dry out everybody's hands and eventually it leads to cuts and cracks, and I'm sure we've all been, had that. So I think that needs to be established, especially before we get hit with, because I do think that it's going to come, a new pandemic. I know people think I'm a naysayer. It's not really about that. It's just, I think this pandemic was a long time coming in any event. So
yeah,
we just need to make sure our legislation is sufficient so that both the suppliers and the retailers, the consumers are all protected and all, aren't scrambling in the last minute to label their products correctly. And, lack of clarity, I think that also could, certain aspects and certain sections in the standards could be more clear. But obviously, maybe it's all probably a work in progress. I think as I was saying earlier, every industry has been affected by COVID, so we're still all in the recovery phase.
Absolutely. Janet Tomkow-Coetzer, thank you so much for your time today and for talking to us about hand sanitizers. Really appreciate your time. And you are, of course, at Hahn & Hahn Attorneys in Pretoria here in South Africa. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for having me.
Are you or your business in trouble and struggling to find a solution? Call Hahn & Hahn Attorneys as we assist clients in finding solutions. We specialize in consumer and food law, commercial and construction law, forensic investigations and administrative law. Visit hahnlaw.co.za. That's HAHN. We assist clients nationwide. Hahn & Hahn Attorneys, because we care. Don't miss Legal Talk with Hahn & Hahn Attorneys, Wednesday mornings at 10 on eRadio.